People ask me sometimes what I was doing the day the null point held. They expect a dramatic answer. A weapons console, maybe. A bridge with amber battle lighting and officers shouting ranges. What they get instead is this. I was sitting in the survey bay of the ITS Orison, a 73-year-old brig that smelled permanently of machine oil and cold coffee, with my drafting tablet in my lap and a half-finished chart of the Vethari corridor on the screen. I was 61 years old. I had spent the last 30 of those years measuring things that did not want to be measured, mapping spaces that two civilizations had been fighting over for 80 years without either of them ever having the instruments to understand what those spaces actually were. That is why they sent me. That is why they sent the Orison. The null point sits at the gravitational center of the Vethari corridor, equidistant to within 11 kilometers from the primary mass anchor of the Hethari conclave on one side and the Drevani Reach on the other. 80 years of war over a stretch of space that is, in the end, nobody's. The mathematics of the null had been known for decades. What nobody had ever done was hold it. The conclave's vessels drifted out of the null under their own mass within hours. The Reach's ships were heavier. They drifted faster. The corridor had never been occupied by either power for longer than a standard shift, and both powers had used that instability as an argument for why the other side could not be trusted to negotiate in good faith. We tried to hold it. They pushed us out. 80 years of that. 80 years of a mathematical problem being used as a political excuse. The Orison carried survey-grade positioning instruments that no military vessel in the Terran fleet bothered to maintain, because military vessels had no use for 11-kilometer precision. I had spent 3 decades calibrating those instruments. I knew the null point the way a man knows a stretch of river he has fished since childhood. Every current, every eddy, the exact place where the water does and does not move. Captain Orison Solis did not ask me how long we could hold the point. She asked me where, exactly, the point was. I gave her coordinates to 6 decimal places. She took the Orison in at 1/4 thrust and cut engines entirely when my console told me to, and the old brig settled into the null like something finding the place it had always been meant to rest. The positioning drives made one small correction, 17 meters starboard, 3 meters down, and then went quiet. On my instruments, the drift counter read 0. It stayed there. We had been holding for 4 hours when the conclave fleet arrived. I heard the sensor officer's voice from the forward bay, flat and careful the way trained people go when they are frightened. 14 vessels, Hethari configuration, bearing 27 Mark 11. They are painting us. Solis did not answer immediately. I looked at my drift counter. 0. I did not move from my seat. 6 hours after that, the Drevani Reach came in from the opposite bearing. 22 ships, heavier tonnage, the deep sensor signature of their carrier class at the back of the formation. The sensor officer gave the same report in the same flat voice, and I understood that she was frightened the way professional people are when they have decided to be frightened quietly and do their jobs anyway. I respected her for it. Both fleets held at the edge of the corridor. They had been doing that for 80 years, across a gap that no single vessel from either side had ever occupied for longer than a shift. Now a Terran survey brig sat in the exact center of it and did not move, and neither fleet could fire across the null at the other without firing at us first. And we were not doing anything except sitting there with our instruments reading 0 and our engines off, and our navigation lights burning steady amber in the dark. Solis came back to the survey bay once during the 7th hour. She did not sit down. She stood at the hatch and looked at my instruments for a moment, and then she said, "How long can you hold it?" I said, "As long as the drives stay calibrated. Months if we need to. The point doesn't move. We just have to stay where the point is." She nodded once and went back forward. The conclave hailed us on the 14th hour. I was not on the bridge for the exchange, but I heard the recording afterward. A Hethari senior voice asking who we were and what authority we held in the corridor, and Captain Solly's answering in the same register she used for everything, unhurried, without heat, that we were a survey vessel of the Terran Exploration Corps, that we held authority under Article 7 of the Vethari Approaches Agreement of '94, that we were conducting a positional survey of the gravitational null, and that we had no intention of departing until the survey was complete. The Hethari voice asked how long that would be. Solly said she wasn't certain. She said that null point surveys were, by their nature, ongoing. The Reach hailed us 2 hours later. The exchange was nearly identical. I listened to both recordings 3 times that evening, sitting in the survey bay with the lights low and the drift counter still reading 0, and what struck me each time was the same thing. Neither fleet had asked us to leave. They had asked us what we were doing there. That was a different question entirely. I have thought about why that was in the years since. The Orison was not a warship. She was not impressive by any standard a military culture would use to measure such things. She was old and asymmetric, and her hull was patched in 4 places, and her running lights were the original fittings from her first commission, because I had never allowed anyone to replace them on the grounds that they were calibrated to the survey instruments, and any replacement would need to be recalibrated from scratch, which would take longer than anyone wanted to spend. She looked, in other words, exactly like what she was, a working vessel, occupied by people who had a specific task to do and were doing it with the equipment they had. What she was not was uncertain. The drift counter read 0 and stayed there, hour after hour, because I knew where the point was and Solly's had put us on it exactly, and neither of those things required an audience or a demonstration. We did not hold the null point to prove something to the conclave or to the Reach. We held it because it was the survey, and the survey was what we were there for, and the mathematics said 0, and the mathematics was correct. I think that is what neither fleet knew what to do with. They had been fighting for 80 years over a point that neither of them could hold. We held it on the first attempt, without weapons, without a fleet behind us, with a vessel that looked like it had been repaired by someone who cared more about the instruments than the paint. And then we simply stayed. The first HETHARI delegation arrived on the 20th hour, a single shuttle, no escorts, requesting docking clearance. SOLIS granted it without consulting anyone, which was within her authority under Article 7, and which I think surprised the delegation more than anything else about us. The Reach delegation came 6 hours after that. SOLIS put both delegations in the forward conference room, a space I had been using up until that point to store supplementary chart cylinders, and she moved the chart cylinders herself, without asking anyone to do it for her, and she made coffee, and she left them there to talk. I do not know what was said in that room. I was in the survey bay, doing what I had come to do, and the drift counter read 0, and outside the hull, on 2 sides of the corridor, 36 warships that had been shooting at each other for 80 years held their positions and did not fire. They signed the preliminary framework 11 days later. I was not present for that either. I had gone back to my charts. What I know is this. The null point had been unclaimed for 80 years not because it was contested, but because neither side had the instruments to stay on it. It was not a political problem. It was a measurement problem, and nobody had ever sent a surveyor. When people ask me what the first thing we showed the conclave and the Reach was, I tell them the same thing every time. It was not strength. It was not numbers. It was not any of the things that the two of them had been measuring against each other for 8 decades. It was a drift counter reading 0, and a ship that did not move from the place where the mathematics said it should be. Some things, once they have been measured correctly, do not need to be argued about anymore. You just have to find someone with the instruments precise enough to take the reading. The Orison is in a museum now. The drift counter is still installed. When I visited 3 years ago, it read 0. I did not find that surprising. I had always known where the point was.